Paul Shinn has held numerous budget and finance positions in Oklahoma, including with the Oklahoma House of Representatives, the Oklahoma Department of Human Services, the cities of Oklahoma City and Del City, as well as several local governments in Oregon. And we're glad that we're the O state that he ended up in. Paul has been a leading voice in the monitoring and evaluation of government budget and tax policies at both the state and local levels in Oklahoma. His work has been at the heart of OK Policy's annual budget highlight, analysis, and other timely review of government operations. He's also the primary author of OK Policy's online budget guide, which is the only resource of its kind to help understand Oklahoma's budget and budget process. It is my humble honor to welcome my colleague, Paul Shinn.
Thanks very much, Shiloh. And I echo your thanks for all of our colleagues at OK Policy who work so hard to put events on like this. It's once again, there's a first time for everything, and this is the first time for a virtual state budget summit. Also want to thank all of you who joined today for your interest in and your support of OK Policy. Today, I'll be talking about the short and the long-term budget outlook for the state of Oklahoma and propose some ideas to improve it. But first, I want to take a step back and talk about what budgeting really does and what our budget decisions say about us. At its heart, budget policy is moral policy. Our budget decisions reflect our morals and our ethics and our values as an entity, as a state, as a community. There are 4 ways where that happens. First, when we decide how much of our resources should be devoted to government, we're deciding what responsibility we owe to each other and what's the value of joint action versus private action. Second, when we decide to spend on something, we're saying it's more important than something else. And you cannot spend on something without not spending on something else. You can't do a tax refund or a tax rebate without not spending it on something else. Sometimes that's a decision about what's more important, the present or the future. When we decide how to pay for our shared actions through taxes and fees, we're deciding each person's responsibility to the community and to our shared goals. Finally, fourth, the way we make these decisions, what's appropriate for discussion, who makes the decision, in what environment, and who has input, shape the budget that comes out of the process. In budgeting, as everywhere else, decisions are always made by people at the table, and they always favor those who have a seat at the table. This summer, OK Policy will release a comprehensive tax and budget roadmap in which we'll lay out a way in which we can dramatically change, and we would argue improve, Oklahoma over the next 4 or 5 years. You don't need to wait for that document to get our views on each of these major moral questions. I'm going to clearly lay out all 4 questions in the context of where we've been in Oklahoma and suggest how we can move toward greater prosperity and participation, both in the coming legislative session and, more importantly, in the years to come. For context, for both this year and the coming years, we must acknowledge and reverse the damages of COVID-19. Those include a frayed safety net, growing inequality, and a recession that lingers on and leaves long-term unemployment and failed businesses in its wake. Employment in Oklahoma last month was the same as it was in 2008. We've lost 12 years of economic growth. Usually takes 4.5 to 5.5 years for employment to return to the peak that it was before a recession. It means it'll be 2024 before as many Oklahomans are working as were working last January. Women are hit particularly hard by this recession, and women of color the hardest of all, because closed schools, failed child care providers, and loss of service jobs have reduced the ability of women to work and to help support their families. Finally, many experts don't expect oil prices to consistently return to pre-pandemic levels for as long as a decade, and all agree that oil and gas employment is not likely to ever reach its last peak. All of that means that in the absence of new thinking and a change in budget policy, Our state and local governments are facing lower revenue for the budget and more expenses for public services for several years to come. That's a challenge we must face head on, and we must start right away. So let's, pardon me, let's return to the first two of our moral questions. What responsibility do we owe to each other? And what's so important that we must do it at the expense of doing something else? Those are questions of what we call revenue sufficiency, or whether government has the means to do what we expect from it. At OK Policy, we believe that our responsibilities to each other and to Oklahoma's future are great, and that government is the mechanism by which we can effectively and most successfully shape a future where all Oklahomans can prosper. We believe that shared investment in prosperity for all Oklahomans is more important than tax cuts and tax breaks for only a few of us. We believe we should be investing in the basics that define quality of life for everybody: health, safety, nutrition, housing, infrastructure, security, good jobs that support a family, and children who grow up to be healthy, happy, and productive adults. We believe we should spend the most on the services and the programs that will pay off the best in the long run. You probably expected you would see some slides today, and I don't want to let you down. So let's look at the first couple and talk about where we are and where we've been in revenue sufficiency. Now, over the last 2 decades, our revenue has become less sufficient because we've dramatically reduced taxes, particularly for large businesses and for high-income households. You can see here that out of every $100 of income in Oklahoma, $7.96, about $1.13 goes to state and local taxes. That's what we've decided to put into the public sphere for public decision-making for shared services. It's considerably lower than the $9.16 that it was just 15 years ago. It's also considerably lower than and remains lower than what the United States average has ever been. Oklahoma has been and remains a low tax state. If we went back just to where we were in 2004, our budget would have another $2 billion to spend on those key services like health and education. And lower revenues means lower budgets. And so here we're looking at the state's budget, $7.7 billion this year, $8.2 billion next year from the preliminary estimate of the Board of Equalization. If you adjust for inflation and you adjust for population growth, the equivalent budget in fiscal year 2000 was $11 billion. And so we have lost nearly $3 billion, 24% of the budget over that time. The question we have to ask ourselves about that is, have we made the right investments so that our state thrives? Now, measuring just by the budget, you'd have to say, no, we haven't, because what we've done is we have shrunk our budget. And that means we're spending less on all those items that I talked about earlier that are really essential for an effective and thriving community. So many windows. All right. These decisions are reversible, though, and we have many options to make revenue sufficient going forward. To do that, we first need to hit the brakes pretty hard, pretty fast. We can do that by stopping any further tax cuts, whether they're broad-based reductions like we did over the early years of this century, or if they're exemptions, deductions, credits, incentives, small things that add up. And the first thing we have to do to fix the budget is fix the economy, turn it around and build for the future. And we do that by making smart investments and putting more money into the hands of regular Oklahomans who will spend it in our state and our communities, and they'll spend more in taxes, and we can provide them more in services. And let's begin with workers. We are fond of saying that we value work in Oklahoma, but we often don't follow through by valuing workers. We need to start doing that, and we can do that by expecting more from the private sector as well. It's time to increase the state minimum wage. The federal minimum wage, same as the states, is $7.25 an hour. If it had kept up with inflation in the last 50 years, it would be $12.06 an hour. And it's important to remember how hard it is to live on $7.25 an hour. Even in low-cost areas like Southeast Oklahoma, a full-time worker has to make $10.16 just to pay the basic living costs of a single adult. That's why 29 states have higher minimum wages, including 4 of our surrounding states. And the minimum wage will affect so many Oklahomans. 26% of Oklahoma workers make less than the poverty level. And that's a waste of our most valuable resource, people. And it's a drag on our economy, and it's time to fix it. Why is this a budget issue? Because higher wages means higher incomes and more consumption, and that means more tax dollars flowing into the state and our communities. And it saves the state money on assistance programs. And those benefits all multiply through the years as children who grew up better off are better off as adults. Paid family and medical leave will also make a positive difference for workers, their employers, and their children, and their families. The United States is one of just 2 countries on this planet with no paid family medical leave program. That's why 6 other states have programs like this, and many others are in the process of creating them. Research shows that paid family leaves helps children's health, increases employees' ability to stay with their current employers, and reduces the inequalities that are faced at work by women, Black and Latinx workers, and rural workers. And there's a part for the public sector to play as well in building our shared responsibility to each other. We must complete Medicaid expansion fully and quickly, and we must preserve the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority's low-cost, efficient, and fair management of Medicaid, rather than use out-of-state managed care providers who will reduce services and add bureaucracy that diverts our medical professionals from helping Oklahomans get healthier. And we need to reform fines, fees, and bail. Too many Oklahomans are in jail just because they're poor. Our courts are essential services. Many would argue the most essential function of government. So that means we should fund them from taxes. If we do that, we can reduce or eliminate fees and give the justice involved better access to housing, credit, and work. We could also use our public funds to invest in economic growth and higher quality of life. And we can do that by spending more on universal, affordable broadband, early childhood education, and home visiting programs, supporting and rebuilding our childcare industry so that parents can get back to work, doubling down on career education for people who have lost their jobs and need new skills. We can also raise revenue, and we don't need a general tax increase to do it. We can reduce tax exemptions, credits, and deductions. We can broaden the sales tax base to reflect our service-based economy, and by culling out the list of hundreds of exemptions for special interests. We can also better target our retiree benefits to low and middle income seniors, and not to all seniors, whether they need it or not. And we can require combined reporting for the corporate income tax so that large multinational corporations that make profits from Oklahoma and benefit from our government services can't hide income from our states or any other state's corporate income taxes. So that's the first two questions. That's what we at OK Policy believe we need to do to create a greater, more joint, more open effort in budgeting. The next question, what's each person's responsibility to that effort to support spending on our shared interests and responsibility? That's what we call revenue fairness. And we believe that we should ask every Oklahoman to pay taxes based on their ability to pay, and that any two taxpayers with the same ability to pay should pay the same amount in taxes. And here's a little bit of context on that. What we've got here is the share of income that goes to taxes for the lowest 20% of people by income. So in Oklahoma at present, 13.2% of income goes to state and local taxes. That's quite a bit increased from the 9.9% just 25 years ago. And the red line is our surrounding states, the median of our surrounding states. You can see that we have gone to one of the fairer tax systems in our region to one of the least fair. Only Texas taxes low income people more than we do. You could have an argument about what is fair taxation. I don't think very many people would suggest taxing those who least can afford it the most is fair taxation. Some would argue that maybe taxes should be proportional, that maybe we should all pay the same percentage of our taxes, or our income in taxes. So what would that look like? Here we're going, this is that lowest 20%, people who make under 20,000. The next 20, the middle 20, all the way up to the top 1%. And what we see is people in the bottom 60% of Oklahoma's incomes, that's the majority, would see a tax cut if our tax system was proportional. Whereas tax would increase for people making over 56,000, relatively small amounts at least. People in the top 1%, and that's people making over 456,000, average income in this group is 1.1 million, they would pay more. Now, it's important to remember how closely race and income remained tied in our economy. And so a tax system that requires more from low income people is also going to require more from people of color. So let's take a look at the tax paid by the average person in Oklahoma by race. So the average white person in Oklahoma, white household, pays 9% of their income in taxes. The average Black person, 9.7%, with other people of color, Hispanic, Indigenous, and multiracial being somewhere in between the two. That's quite a difference, particularly when you look at the low end of the income scale. So we have an opportunity to make taxes fairer, not just by income, but if taxes were proportional, then by definition, the average for every race would be the same. And that's a big step toward racial, economic, and tax justice. And it's a step that we can take here in Oklahoma. Take me just a sec here to get all these windows working. Let's think also about the second half of that question that I asked. Do people with the same ability to pay actually pay the same in taxes? In Oklahoma, that's not the case. Our tax system shows what happens when you let the government arbitrarily pick winners and losers. It's often based on who's well represented at the Capitol and who turns out to vote. So we use the tax system to favor retirement earnings over work, to favor home ownership over renting, to favor filmmakers over visual artists and musicians, to favor aerospace engineers over civil engineers, and to favor large corporations over small and Oklahoma-owned businesses. Now, as with revenue sufficiency, there are a lot of options available, both this year and in the future, to move toward revenue fairness. And as with revenue sufficiency, first thing to do is stop the bleeding. That means freezing further tax reductions and credits and incentives. And it means being more thoughtful and transparent about all of these tax breaks. They all need to have sunset dates. They should all have maximum annual limits. And those limits should shrink during downturns rather than just all the shrinkage having to be from the general revenue fund. Those incentives need to be evaluated for their economic and social impacts. And those with benefit, those who benefit, should be required to disclose what help they get from the state and how it affects their operations in the state. After that, there are some easy options to make taxes fairer across the income and race spectrums. We need to restore the income tax credit refundability, and we need to increase the credit over time. Ours is one of the lowest state EITCs and one of the few remaining non-refundable ones. We need to restore the buying power of the sales tax relief credit, which helps make up for the cost of sales tax on groceries. It hasn't changed since 1990. We need to provide renters with the same property tax relief that homeowners get. We need to repeal unproductive and unfair tax incentives. They're unfair almost by definition, and most of them are unproductive. So let's move on to the final question. Open for discussion. Who makes decisions and who has input? Another way to think about that is let's talk about what's on the table and who's got a seat at the table and who's sitting behind the people at the seats at the table and has their ears. Right now, most fiscal decisions are made by just a handful of lawmakers and those who have access to them. And the result's been what I just described: insufficient public investment, taxes that discriminate by income and by race, and decisions that favor those who are at the table. But let's think for a few minutes about not just who's at the table, but how much money's on the table. This chart talks about earmarked revenues. Earmarking means that money coming into the state is legally restricted to a specific use. That means that it doesn't go into our general fund. Now, the general fund is important because it is the only source of funding that could finance any legal purpose of the state. So in Oklahoma, nearly 3/4 of our revenue never sees the general fund. It's earmarked for a range of special purposes: health programs, education programs, road programs, local governments, retirement funds, and on and on and on and on. Those may be, and they are, important uses, but we've decided to take the discussion of whether they're important and what they're more or less important than off the table. Every year, the legislature does not look at these funds. And you can see that over time, the percentage in Oklahoma that we've earmarked has gone up from 62 to 73%. And you can see that we earmark more than the average state. If we went back to 2002 and we earmarked 63 instead of 73%, we'd have another $2.2 billion in the budget. Also want to talk about the process by which the budget is created. The legislature is constitutionally required to develop a budget, and it should be balanced every year. That's true in the constitutionally required is true in 50 states. The balanced budget is true in 49. What varies in states is how open the process of doing that budget is. And in Oklahoma, as Shiloh mentioned, we just don't have a great record on budget transparency. This next slide little bit hard to read, but I want to focus on the numbers in the red bars. This is the time in each of our surrounding states, and this is in 2019, before the dark times. This is the number of calendar days that each state spent openly deliberating that budget, meaning the beginning of this period in Texas, this is when there's a budget bill that proposes exact expenditures and requirements on each agency. Texas took over 4 months to take that budget, a whole budget, to hold hearings, to have votes, to have amendments. They had recorded votes on over 500 specific amendments to the budget. We had votes on 0. The reason that's important is it lets me know how the people who represent me voted on things like teacher pay or incentives for the film industry or Medicaid expansion. I can hold them accountable. I can say, I'm glad you did that. I'm going to help you with your campaign. Or I can say, I think I'm going to run against that person. Now let's compare quickly to the other states. You'll see Arkansas and Louisiana, they have 3 months worth of budget deliberation. Kansas, a couple months. Colorado and New Mexico, a little bit less, month and a half, less than a month in Colorado. We had 8 days. So why does this matter? Why does it matter that there's transparency? Transparency is integrity. Transparency builds trust between voters and those who represent us. Transparency is an antidote to influence peddling and to every form of corruption. It's just hard to be corrupt in a transparent world. We can make both the budget itself and the process we use to create it much, much more transparent. As always, let's stop the bleeding first. That means we should not earmark any further revenue for any reason, no matter how noble it seems now, because we're making decisions for people who haven't even been born yet once we legally earmark it. Then we should add sunset dates of no more than 3 years for all the present earmarks. Require legislative and expert analysis of each of those. What's it doing for the state? What's it costing to the state? Is it still a high priority? And then a supermajority vote of the legislature for those to be continued for another 3 to 5 years at most. Budget transparency is a pretty easy problem to solve. And we just do it like virtually every other state does. We have legislative deadlines for committees on each side and for floor votes on each side. We just need to have a budget bill ready to go on the first deadline and go. We need to open up committee discussions. We need to allow testimony of citizens, and we need to have public votes on amendments and each stage of the budget process. At Oklahoma Policy Institute, we believe Oklahoma needs a moral checkup and a new approach to budgeting. For this century so far, too many decisions have favored private interests over public ones, have given tax breaks to those who are wealthy and don't need them, paired with tax increases for those who are poor and can't afford them. We've taken too many decisions off the table and left no chairs at the table for regular people. Some Oklahomans are happy with this, but we're not among them, and we don't think you should be either. In the coming legislative session and beyond, let's push our elected leaders to make wise investments in our future and work toward a prosperous state where there's true opportunity for everyone, where people are treated fairly regardless of their power, their income, and their race, and where we all have a say in our shared destiny. Thank you for your attention and patience, and I believe we have some time to answer some of your questions. Our Deputy Director, Shiloh Kantz, has been monitoring them. Shiloh, what should we talk about first?
First, Paul, is a statement that says funding Medicaid expansion takes money away from education funding. I keep hearing this statement. Is that true? And what's a useful answer to it if it's not?
It could be true, but it doesn't have to be true. There are last year, the legislature passed and the governor vetoed the SHOP fee in which hospitals share in the funding. There are other fee possibilities that there are. The simple way to pay for it is to reduce tax benefits that don't work. The cost of the capital gains exemption, for example, is roughly the cost of Medicaid expansion. That helps a handful of people whose income is over $200,000. It creates maybe 100 jobs a year. At the same time, Medicaid expansion creates over 10,000 jobs a year. So that's a good answer. And there are lots of other good answers.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Got a second question. Is the state's lower revenue expected to lead to cuts for agencies, specifically the Department of Corrections and for the Oklahoma Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services?
It seems unlikely that there will be substantial cuts this year because the revenue is estimated to be higher in the coming fiscal year 2022 than it is in the current one. However, there's definitely a risk of further cuts after that. This coming year is probably another mini peak in which we have lower budgets. But again, remember, budgets are not determined by revenue estimates. Budgets are determined by lawmakers. And if we're concerned about whether corrections is adequately funded, hint, it's not, and whether we're putting the kind of investment in mental health that will really transform our state, we aren't, then we need to ask our legislators to find revenues to fund those things.
Awesome. So another question, how can we as regular people bring transparency to the state budgeting process?
You know, that's a great question. I hope you'll share information from us and from other interest groups, groups that work on issues that are important to you. There is nobody who works at the Capitol other than legislators who think this system is right. We're in a position, as Shiloh has said, we've always been in a position where we can say out loud, we don't think this position is right. Work with those groups and ask your legislator, where are you on the budget? What are you pushing for? What are you not pushing for? Why can't I see it? And it's just going to, this is one of those things that is going to take just a long, hard, consistent work on the part of everybody to make sure the legislators understand we're watching them. We know what they do is important, and that's why we'd like a say in it. And we expect them to keep us informed.
Perfect. Regarding fair taxes, what would renters, tenants having opportunity to take property taxes look like?
You know, the easiest way to do that, and it's done by about a dozen states right now, is you give them an income tax credit. First of all, it's probably important to say renters do pay property taxes. I don't know if you've ever been a renter, but every time my rent went up, the landlord said it was because taxes went up. The easy way to do that then is just give a tax refund at income tax time that's equal to what people like Shiloh and I who own our homes get in the homestead exemption. That's about $110 per household per year. It's not a huge amount, but renters are much more likely to be housing insecure than homeowners are.
Great, thanks, Paul. Next question, let's see. Have there been any bills filed to address some of these issues or your suggestions for 2022 bill filing?
There are some really good bills out there, and I apologize that I'm still sifting through them, so I can't give you a quick list of bills. There are multiple bills that would add a requirement just in statute, not in the Constitution, that tax cuts and expenditures and incentives have the same supermajority vote requirement in the legislature that tax increases do. And that's a great place to start. There are several bills that expand or restore refundability of the earned income tax credit. There are several minimum wage bills. A good place to start on minimum wage is to eliminate the state preemption and allow communities to set their own minimum wage. But ultimately, we're going to have to increase the minimum wage statewide to be competitive with our neighbors. There are also bills that would reduce or sunset some tax incentives. Not surprisingly, there are more bills that would expand them. And so that's a great place to start, is work as hard as we can against those bills and then start to turn the tide there.
So slow and steady.
Stop and turn. Slow down and make a turn.
That's right. I can hear our governor saying that special tax breaks are the only best way to entice new businesses to move here. How do other states handle issues like this, and what would our rebuttal to that be?
There are very few states that are good on that. You know, nobody wants to be the first people to demilitarize. There are states that are more rigorous about analyzing and limiting, and there are states we're by far from the most, or far from the most generous state. What we need to understand is evidence is overwhelming that these incentives don't work. You know, you don't have to only look at liberal economists to tell you that the incentives don't work. Conservative economists tell you that. Libertarian economists tell you that. The Cato Institute, libertarian, did a study of 39 studies of incentives and found out that 36 of them showed that incentives harm or make no difference in local economies. Somebody else did a study that incentives are pretty much the least effective spending for an economy, that education, that anything for children is more likely to return something to the economy than incentives are.
Awesome. We had a couple of questions on your slides for Louisiana having a negative 18 days.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I forgot to mention that. Louisiana is one of, so far I found about 6 states where the budget bill is ready for, is introduced and ready for examination before the session starts. And wow. So that means, you know, Louisiana, and I believe Wisconsin is another one that is already in, they aren't in session yet, but they're already looking at budgets.
Awesome, Paul. So what would you say are people's next steps after they hear your presentation here about the best way to move forward for Oklahoma in the budget process? What do people do after today and tomorrow with their legislators?
I think you need to let your legislator know, and talk with your neighbors, talk to people you work, that it doesn't have to be this way, that we don't need to have kind of this stalled, stagnated, oil-dependent economy. And it's not up to chance how we budget, or it shouldn't be up to chance, and we've left it there. It should be, you know, we need to take control of our future as a community. And we can do that through the budget by making smart investments, making taxes fairer, and putting money in the hands of the people who will spend it.
Great. Will it be easier to get minimum wage raised by doing it by city or the entire state?
Well, I think both ways have been tried. I think ultimately the entire state is the way to do that. Probably pretty optimistic to assume that the legislature would do that this year, but I wouldn't rule it out. There are places like Oklahoma City and Tulsa, and not just them, but Ardmore and Guyman, where the cost of living is such that a $7 minimum wage is a joke. And I think that, you know, we say we're conservatives, we say we believe in local control. I'd like my Oklahoma City Council to decide what the minimum wage is in our community. And if they think it needs to be higher and that's the best thing for our city, I'm for it. And they should have that vote.
Can Medicaid expansion be presented as a subsidy for small employers and low pay employers who use many part-timers to keep these employers competitive and not have to offer health plans?
It can. You have to be really careful with that. It's a two-edged sword. There is no doubt that not just Medicaid, but SNAP and child care subsidy, the earned income tax credit for that matter, that's really helps some employers keep wages down. There is no doubt about that. On the other side, it's really important not to shame employers such that their response is, well, I just won't hire people, or I won't hire low income people, or I won't hire people just out of work. Absolutely, it's true, and it just needs to be described very carefully. The way that I would do it is, and there's a blog post that we'll have coming out this week or next, higher minimum wage saves the state a lot of money in SNAP and in Medicaid and in other things.
Is there a breakdown of all tax revenue sources with the amount of revenue generated from each?
There is, and the easiest way to find it, and I say this is easy, it is for people like me who do this way too much. If you go to the Oklahoma Tax Commission's website and go over to publications, they have something that's called the annual report. And it gives not only where every tax dollar comes from, it also shows where each particular revenue source, how it's spent. So if you want to know, you know, where every dime of your cigarette tax or your income tax or your sales tax goes, there's a great breakdown. It's not hard to follow at all. So that's a great question, and I'd certainly encourage people to do that. Tax Commission does a really, really good job on transparency. If I were to point the legislature towards someone they could learn from, the Tax Commission would be a great place to start.
Awesome. I think we've got time for one or two more. I've got one here in the chat. Is it possible for Tulsa to raise the minimum wage at this time? Would that have to be legislated?
At this time, the legislature prevents Tulsa from having that discussion. I think it was 2014, the legislature did that. It's called preemption. So first, the legislature would have to repeal that preemption bill. And then the city of Tulsa could talk about an ordinance to increase the minimum wage.
Awesome, Paul. Thank you so much for the presentation and for all of your wonderful, wonderful knowledge that you share with all of us. You've got time for a closing remark, and we'll move on from here. One thing I did want to mention as a housekeeping note is the slides and presentations are, like I said before the beginning, we're recording everything, and the slides will be available after at our website, okpolicy.org/state-budget-summit. Paul?
Well, just again, thank you all for your interest and for caring about our state and its future. Thank you, Shiloh, for your help with the questions. Thank you, all of you,